to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Slido box located to the right of the video. Closed captioning is available by hovering over the video and clicking CC at the bottom of the video. You can purchase your copy of the book by clicking on Purchase the Book, which can be found at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you encounter any issues during the event, please contact events@newamerica.org. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Bergen, Vice President at New America. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Jason Burke, who's got a fabulous new book, The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s. Actually, it's a rare example of where the subtitle is as good as the title. Often the subtitle isn't as alluring as that. But Jason is a longtime correspondent for The Guardian, who's covered pretty much every war in the last 3 decades. It's been posted in Johannesburg, Islamabad, where I first met him back in 1998 when he was looking into somebody called Osama bin Laden. And he's the author of 4 other books. So we're thrilled to have you, Jason. Jason's going to talk a little bit about kind of the big themes and story of his book, and then I will engage him in a little discussion. And then also I'll be monitoring the Slido app for your questions, which I will feed to Jason as they come in. So Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's very kind. It is indeed a long time since we both swapped tales about a very unknown, still young Saudi in the late 90s in a bar in Peshawar. We were in the bar, not the Saudi, obviously. But in a sense, I mean, mentioning that, I wrote the book partly because of those kind of experiences and the work that I'd done on Islamic militancy, and you yourself has done, as well as others. So the book began as a project when I was asked to write about ISIS in the 2010s, and I was thinking about how I was going to approach the subject, and it was very difficult to do any original reporting. One of the strategies I thought might work was to do a short history of Islamic militancy that show the longer roots, the deeper roots, the historical roots of ISIS. And I put something together. It was quite long, 50,000 words, 60,000 words of it. It didn't really work. So I junked it, wrote a different book instead. But it took me to a really interesting place, because I'd been thinking that the origins of modern extremist Islamism were probably to be found in the 80s, as you and I have both written, and many others had done too, primarily in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, but also in the upsurge of extremist Islamist activity across much of the Middle East during that decade. And so I was quite surprised to find myself back in the mid-60s, and to see it really as a profoundly formative moment for what would grow into the much broader movement of Islamic extremism as we know it today. And as I looked at that moment, it became clear to me that to consider it in isolation in terms of Islamism would be wrong. And it fitted with an interest that I'd had for a long time, which was to look at the perpetrators, the groups, the individuals who were behind the first wave of international terrorism in the 70s. I say international in the sense that it was genuinely transnational, that it was targeting often third parties to a conflict. It had a global reach, global range, global ambitions often. And that period, the 70s, was obviously full of characters that I kind of half knew, like Carlos the Jackal. It was full of events that I half knew. like the Munich Olympics attack of 72, the Entebbe raid of 76, many of which will be familiar to anyone who's looked at this field of study, or indeed watched some extremely good, although quite often inaccurate, as I found, Hollywood films, or even not Hollywood films, a lot of European films about Carlos or about the German Red Army faction and so forth. And I was interested in both, and I noticed how the origins of both appeared to start in the same place. It was in the mid to late 60s. For example, you had the execution of Sayyid Qutb, who obviously goes on to be the great ideologue of Sunni jihadism. Subsequently, and in 1966. In 1967, you have the execution or killing of Che Guevara, who goes on to be the great icon and actually tactically and strategically very influential for leftists for at least the next decade or so. And I thought those kind of coincidences were interesting and important, and something that was very much worth digging into. I didn't know of anyone who looked at both as revolutionary projects, aiming through violence to bring about transformative change, with as an aim, a very broad aim, a kind of a utopia of social justice and security and prosperity, but in the short term, quite similar enemies: imperialism, capitalism, or at least Western capitalism, America, Israel. And these sort of commonalities intrigued me, and I thought it would be worth investigating. So that was one reason to get going on this, what was a very large project. It took about a decade with lots and lots of sources and lots of languages. But it did take me into some very interesting places, and allowed me to study what I wanted to study, which was the groups and the radicals who were active in that period. And one thing that I was really interested in was how, at the beginning of the decade, you had attacks, big transnational, spectacular attacks, clearly motivated in part by, in fact, almost entirely by a desire to grab the attention of the world's media, but that focused on targets such as relatively new passenger jets flying hundreds of people around, but that were largely non-lethal. There were casualties, and one or two instances were significant numbers. But on the whole, the aim was, as Brian Jenkins later said, in 1975, to have lots of people watching and not a lot of people dead. And only 10 years later, 11, 12 years later, you're getting mass casualty attacks involving truck bombs with a suicide attacker as a driver, with the suicide of that individual an integral part of both the tactical and the performative aim of the operation. And that was a vast change. I mean, that was a really significant change, and it took us to a place which is now tragically familiar to us. So I thought exploring that and quite how and why that happened quite quickly, in fact, would be an interesting and important thing to do. That obviously brought me to lots of questions about the relationship between the leftist activism that was largely nationalist, largely secular, revolutionary, as I say, linked very much to that moment in the late 60s, 1968 and so forth, where you had a global moment of energy, of activism, of sometimes violence, and the Islamism that was also developing in the Middle East in parallel. Now, in some of the reviews of my book, all of which have been very generous, happily, but there's some, as ever, reviewers often bring a lot of their own views to the book, which is fine. I mean, that's the point of a book. and engage with it in a particular way. But one of the things that some of them have been trying to stress is, or appear to think, is that my argument is that leftism somehow created Islamism, which isn't actually what I'm arguing at all. But what I am arguing is that two things. One is that the repression of leftism, or its failures, its own failures and mistakes and inadequacies, that the leftist, nationalist, more secular, more progressive ideological strand, revolutionary strand in the Middle East, its failures and its eventual destruction opened the way to Islamism because it created a vacuum. And there were still plenty of very angry, often young people who had grievances that they sought to redress, but with no leftist possibilities of action. No, the groups were destroyed, the people were dead or exiled or in prison. Many turned to Islamism. And there are examples of individuals actually turning, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the same people, but broadly the same demographics certainly do. And that I thought was important. The other point I'm making is that the Islamists borrowed quite a lot from the left, or the nationalist, more broadly secular activists and groups. And now that is inevitable in a sense, if you think about it. Whether you're in Iran or Syria or anywhere in the Islamic world, you are obviously well aware of what others are doing. This was a moment where the dominant form of activist ideology was, at least in the first few years of the decade, nationalist, socialist to an extent, secular-ish, with variations that we can discuss, but on the whole, and very much part coming out of the anti-colonial movements of earlier decades. And that I thought was really interesting. You can see vocabulary that moves over, that is shared. You can see enemies that are shared. So capitalism, Western decadence, in a sense, is shared. Consumerism for one, moral decadence for the other. Big divergences, obviously, social conservatism, so forth on one side, absolutely the opposite on the other. But anti-Zionism, a degree of anti-Semitism sometimes. These things were common. And there are words that I was able to chase, particularly important words that you could follow the trail from major leftist thinkers through to Islamist thinkers, and even onto people who you'd really not suspect of using such vocabulary, like the Ayatollah Khomeini, actually. So that is a complex area that hopefully we'll get to talk about, but it absolutely isn't the case that the leftists somehow led to the Islamists. But there is, in some places, a shared vocabulary and a shared vision. In other places, there certainly isn't. And it's definitely worth saying that there was very limited, if any, I didn't find any examples of influence the other way of the Islamists to the leftists. There's some sympathy, there's kind of early sympathy for Khomeini, for example, in the Iranian Revolution among European leftists, for example, and elsewhere, but nothing that way. So that was the other thing. A third thing, and I'll just end this kind of intro with that, is one of the things I was very keen to do with the book was to place all this violent activism within the framework of the Cold War, which is obviously inescapable. And that's partly because I think I was influenced by a lot of really interesting new writing about the global Cold War of the last 10 years, 20 years that has come through. Some brilliant scholars who are exploring a much less Eurocentric view of the Cold War. And I was interested in integrating some of that thinking and scholarship into my account, but it was more because I just wanted to see everything in the round and put it all in its context. And a couple of things that threw up were really interesting. One was the attitude of the Soviets, of Moscow, to people like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, for example, the PFLP, or even Yasser Arafat, key individuals in the Palestinian armed struggle, as they called it. It was also interesting to see the Soviet attitude to actors using terrorism as a tactic elsewhere. And on the whole, it was pretty negative. The the Brezhnev called some of these people adventurists. He was very skeptical that, as he put it, 3 or 4 young people with Kalashnikovs could sort of change the course of history. I mean, as a good Marxist historian, obviously that would be his view in terms of the classic Marxist dialectics, and that was quite widespread, even in the KGB, who often actually sought to restrain actors who they otherwise could have been encouraging. There was so that's something we can talk about. I thought that was really interesting. The whole debate, obviously, of Soviet sponsorship of terrorism blew up massively in the early 80s, became very highly politicized, and sorts of very interesting arguments within the American security establishment, which were fascinating and important and contribute a lot to our understanding of terrorism today. And I think on that, the other thing I wanted to make clear with the Cold War stuff was, and I found and was interested by, was how major events that have been considered really in isolation take on a very different look when you consider regional and even geopolitical contexts. So, for example, the famous raid on Entebbe of 76, when the Israelis flew their special forces, including the current prime minister's brother, led by the current prime minister's brother, down to Uganda to free around 100 Jewish and Israeli hostages that were still being held by a breakaway faction of the PFLP, and did so successfully. They were able to do that, yes, because they had the audacity to try it, and they had extraordinary capabilities that they developed over the previous 3 or 4 years, arguably longer. But they were also able to do it because they could land the planes afterwards, the transporters that they'd used to get down there, in Kenya. And without that, it would have been impossible or extremely risky. In fact, it would have gone wrong because they would have had to try and refuel with Ugandan fuel in the airport. Instead, they could go to Nairobi, sort themselves out. They had a hospital ship, a hospital plane there, all sorts of backup ready. And without that, it would have been very difficult to do. So that was just an example of because the Kenyans decided very quietly that they were going to let the Israelis do that because they wanted to keep in pretty much with Washington, or at least with the West, even with the British. And they wanted to just hedge their bets in that Cold War struggle that was Africa at the time. They said to the Israelis, okay, you can do this, but we just don't want to know about it. Keep it quiet, stay overnight, and be gone in the morning. And that's allowed this very famous, very celebrated Special Forces success to take place. So those sorts of details I thought were important to introduce into the conversation as well. And so I'll stop there because I could go on for another 40 minutes, which would probably be a bit of a shame. We wouldn't hear from you nor from anyone who's watching. But those are some of the themes that I was trying to unpick. And the only other thing I'd say is obviously the main thing about the book is that I'm looking at, it's not just the events, it's the people, it's the characters. And that's what I use to move the reader through 780 pages rather than the kind of the dry narrative of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and a lot of Cold War politics.
Well, yeah, it's a massive achievement, Jason, and you have a very busy day job. So I'm wondering how you mentioned it took a decade. You also explored sources in like a dozen languages. So how did you work? How did you do that with your busy day job, and how did you deal with the languages, all the different languages you had to deal with?
Well, the day job was an advantage and a disadvantage. I mean, it was a disadvantage when I was writing about stuff that was absolutely nothing to do with the book, which was most of the time. But occasionally it was extremely useful. So in the last 2.5 years, I've spent probably about a third of my time in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Ramallah or Amman, reporting on the Gaza conflict. But that allowed me to talk to and access lots of really important people who I'd been wanting to talk to from a long time, on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, former Mossad people, former Black September people. I was spending some days I would be interviewing a senior Palestinian one day, and then the guy who was trying to kill him the next, in Ramat Gan or somewhere. So it had its advantages. The sources was interesting because I mean, as I went on with the book, things changed quite dramatically. One was a technology emerged that allowed me to actually use AI and other things to translate. So the translation software emerged about halfway through the writing process, and that obviously opened up a kind of vast range of literature, particularly on the West Germans. Massive literature in German. I can do some languages, European languages, mainly the Latin ones, but not German. And so that was really useful. It did mean about, an extra year's reading. But it meant I could get hold of, at the same time, I was building up all these contacts among researchers and journalists and veterans of the whole thing, and people who've been involved, and they were feeding me documents. And so those documents were coming in all sorts of languages, and I got some great French transcripts actually of witness statements from trials that I could read. The German stuff I couldn't, so I was Dutch. I was getting documents in, all sorts of really useful stuff from the period, original documents that I could just scan and read it on my phone. Arabic as well, eventually. So I was reading kind of entire volumes of a genre, little known niche genre of memoirs of Palestinian violent activists at the time. Quite voluminous memoirs, but with some amazing details in them, and I could scan them and go through them. And then there was stuff coming in Hebrew, and so yeah, I mean that it got slightly out of hand. I'm not going to lie. But
Jason, I think you.
it was a fantastic experience, and it material that was untouched in terms of the narrative.
So, the David Rappaport's four waves of terrorism, the anarchist wave, the anti-colonial wave, the leftist wave, and the Islamist jihadist wave. How does, which seems like a reasonably good framework. He points out the anarchist wave sort of burned out because it did, anarchism by definition wasn't really offering much, and the anti-colonial wave burned out because, in a sense, it delivered what it promised, which was getting the French out of Algeria and the British out of Palestine, etc. And then you have the leftist wave, which I guess he kind of says burned out, pretty much with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now we're in this Islamist wave. Does your book kind of track with that, or is it sort of
I'd say that the leftist wave, I think I'd reframe it, and I wouldn't say it's an Islamist wave. I think the fourth wave is an identity wave, and I'd start. It's a very good question. I hadn't really thought about it, but I'd move it all a decade earlier, or even 15 years earlier. So I think the leftist wave had really burnt itself out by the late 70s. Certainly the early 80s. I mean, in Europe, you have the sort of avowed leftists who are buying into this effectively Marxist-Leninist vision of a global revolution, kind of wholesale transformation of economy, society, culture, everything else. You've still got the Red Brigades, although there are not very many of them until the kind of early 80s. There's quite a lot going on in Latin America. But the wave that I'm looking at that comes out of the 60s, comes out of 68, 69, 70, it burns itself out quite fast. And one of the reasons I think it fails is that the political constituency is gone. So quite early on in the decade, if you look at West Germany, which that's what I look at in detail as the kind of case study. At the beginning of the decade, there are studies, quite good surveys showing quite widespread sympathy for the Red Army faction, aka the Baader-Meinhof gang.
Why was
But
that, by the way? Because I mean, it didn't. I mean, at least from my perspective, like for what little I know about them, they didn't seem to be offering much of a positive vision. They just seemed to go around killing people from and not a,
this, well, they hadn't really started killing people yet,
I
or not
see.
very many of them.
Right.
Um, and I think it was still quite close to the late 60s, which is why I'm sort of
Right.
fascinated by that moment. And it's still kind of sticking it to the man. I mean, there was still a lot of, ferment that hadn't yet been drained, either because people got older and got married and had kids and got a job, or because governments did make significant concessions in Western Europe. Um,
What
and
were those
that,
concessions?
well, this is really interesting. So one of the things I say in the book is that in Western Europe, why did the left burn out? I mean, partly because violence, as you know, almost always leads to a degree of revulsion among broader populations. I mean, it's okay killing policemen overseas, but when you do it at home, there's obviously a strong reaction. I mean, we see that all the time. Um, and I think that was certainly important. They weren't very numerous anyway. I mean, a couple of hundred, but the Red Brigades, which was one of the biggest of all organizations in Europe, were a few hundred people, I think, at the maximum strength, really kind of mobilized, hardcore. Red Army faction, less. Um, so you're not talking about very many people. And it's when the mass movement get a lot of what they want. So what did they want in the late 60s? What were they marching for? Better reproductive rights for women. So you get legislation on divorce, on abortion, on much else during the 70s. You get better funding for the universities, and that was overcrowding of universities was a key trigger. You get antiquated hierarchies that are reassessed and largely dismantled, much more or less formality within the university system, for example. You get cultural figures, voting age is lowered, drinking age is lowered. You get cultural figures who are young, sportsmen, musicians, who much obviously featured on national network TVs and networks and so forth. So you get quite a lot, not on the economic side, but in the cultural and social side, other forms of politics, you get quite a lot of those demands being granted. And I think that's the big contrast with the Middle East. I mean, where you get nothing. In fact, it gets much worse, which is why I'd argue that, in Western Europe, the left just fades away because it's partly done its job and partly because nobody thinks it's necessary anymore, and the violence turns people off. Whereas in the Middle East and the Islamic world, the left makes many of the same mistakes, is also very fragmented, but is destroyed. I mean, is specifically targeted, and in some cases, the Islamists are actually actively encouraged, such as in Egypt. Um, uh, and therefore, when the left has gone, and you see this in Iran very clearly, when the left is no longer there, you've still got all those grievances. There's only really one ideology left that offers any kind of obvious solution. Islam is the solution, to coin the phrase. So I think that's a really interesting and important question. But to come back to the point about the really good point, actually, I hadn't thought about. I would say that so by the mid 70s, late 70s, early 80s, that the leftist wave is kind of over. But what you're getting is an identity wave, and so you get identity in terms of locality, sort of nationalism, ethno-separatism, whether it's the Armenians or the Irish or the Basques or the Puerto Ricans or whoever it might be. Indigenous people activism as well, very much. You get environmentalism, which is not identity, but is certainly very different from the kind of leftist internationalism of earlier. But you also get Islamism, which is and white supremacism, and right wing or right wing violence, particularly, which the Turner Diaries is 77, isn't it? So you're looking at I'm quoting your own book back at you, actually, Peter. But the you see that wave coming through, and so I would say that the leftist wave finishes earlier, and it's actually an identity wave that begins as a fourth wave, and that the Islamist Islamists should be considered part of that wave?
Well, that's a very fruitful way of looking at it. So we're in this Islamist wave, which generally people agree started in '79 for a variety of reasons. The other waves burnt themselves out either because they succeeded, the anti-colonial wave basically, or they just sputtered out because their ideas weren't that attractive, as we've sort of discussed on. Do you think this religious wave is burning itself out, has burned itself out, or just will continue because it's hard to abolish God, and there's always going to be a taker for this kind of thing, given the size of the population involved and the small numbers of people who need to have these ideas to kind of keep it going?
If we're talking about now,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's not going to go away. It's not going to just die off. But then, arguably, nor has leftist violence entirely, and it's got transformed into other things, and the energy has gone down different channels, like environmentalism, which is rarely violent, but that allows an outlet for those kind of energies. I think currently, I mean, globally, it's quite an interesting moment, isn't it? In that, I mean, um, where you're seeing the fastest growth is in Islamist activity and influence is sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there are a couple of other places, and I think that speaks to how Islamic extremism fits usefully into local contexts, particularly where there is chaos, a lack of governance, providing, yeah, you could emphasize the ideological side of it if you wanted, but I would more emphasize two things. One, that lack of governance offers opportunity to those kind of actors, but it also grants them a degree of legitimacy often, in that they bring a degree of order and spurious security, which is otherwise lacking for certain communities, obviously. And as we know, over 30, 40 years, Islamist extremism and extremists are very good at exploiting those granular, or have got better and better, actually, I should say, at exploiting those granular dynamics which allow them to graft themselves onto pre-existing local problems. And at the moment, if you're looking for kind of ungoverned space, that, or what's called ungoverned space, I mean, it rarely actually is. It means just not the type of government we recognize or want. But in those areas, and that's where I've spent quite a lot of the last decade anyway, in places like Somalia or Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic Congo, places like that, which are vast tracts of pretty much ungoverned space with communities who are involved in an absolutely Darwinian struggle, Hobbesian struggle, and then Mozambique, another good example, northern Mozambique. That is where Islamism appears to be. This kind of Islamism, the extremist Islamism, is thriving. More broadly, though, obviously, we're talking about jihadis, but if you're talking about the kind of the more Muslim Brotherhood strand, then they're not doing anywhere near as well as they had been at certain other periods, and particularly the most obvious example of militant Islamism that has been violent and caused huge upset, pain, suffering, and so on and so forth is Hamas in the last few years. And that takes us into a completely different space in many ways. So I think that the dynamics are complex and evolving, but the idea that Islamism is not going to, as a broad ideology, is not going to generate an extremist fringe that finds somewhere to get purchase in the coming decades seems to me to be overly optimistic.
Yeah. So now we're more than half a century, we're about half a century into this particular wave and you're saying it probably is not going to expire anytime soon. Well, we have a question from the audience, and please keep the questions coming in the Slido app. Question from David Sermon of New America. Could you discuss what you found about Western disunity in hostage negotiations in the 1970s, of which there were many, efforts to generate disunity, and whether there are lessons for today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, you can look at this. We could talk about the specific examples of hostage crises, and almost all the crises involved the big hijacks involved multiple nationalities. Some less so. But the Entebbe raid crisis certainly did, and the most famous one was the 1970 quintuple hijacking, of which 4 were successful. This is the one that Layla Khalid led, the unsuccessful one in September 1970, and then led to Black September in Jordan and so forth. But it was a huge crisis. Again, one of the reasons it got so big was because there were concerns that it might end up as a superpower clash. This being 1970, and it involved the Swiss government, German government, West German government, British, the Americans primarily, and the Israelis. And it broke down then that the Israelis were saying, right, no negotiations, we're not releasing anybody. They had no citizens, single citizens as opposed to dual nationals among the passengers, the hostages. Golda Meir, she said, no, we're not negotiating. We're not going to release the hundreds of Palestinians, that the prisoners that the hostage takers wanted released. In fact, we're going to detain more. The Swiss and the West Germans made almost instantaneously agreed to all the demands, and then had to backtrack under pressure from Washington. And the British sort of typically hummed and hawed and didn't really know what to do, and in the end did a fairly kind of underhand deal that got them out of the situation. So yeah, I mean, that was a classic example of like everybody negotiating differently and desperate efforts to corral them into a harder line, which really was very difficult. It sort of worked, but in their defense, this was all incredibly new. They didn't even have a language to describe what was happening. You know, were they skyjackers or air pirates? Or there was no legislation even that, you know, so Layla Khalid, having attempted to take over an El Al flight that was ended up putting down in London, a transatlantic flight. She wasn't charged with anything eventually, and the only thing that they could have charged her with were immigration offences. There was sort of no offence of trying to take over a plane in Her Majesty's airspace or something. So they were really up against it. They also had no real options in terms of what else could they do other than negotiate, because the capabilities that even the Israelis developed quite early didn't exist yet. The proof of concept there was 72. So they didn't have a unit of SAS or GIGN or GS9 or whoever it was to send in. That came later. So there were discussions. I was reading the presidential brief, and then there's some various where Nixon's being told what's happening, and there's some great accounts of a discussion he's having with people like Kissinger, and he's saying, right, well, let's send in the Green Berets or someone, and everybody's looking at each other, sort of going, well, we can't do that, Mr. President. We don't know where any of the hostages are. They're not trained to do it. They're nowhere near. I mean, it's just not going to work. So that they developed those capabilities much later, which gave them the option of doing that. The other thing I'd mention is you can look at much more broadly, is that a lot of the different nations involved in the sort of who were targeted by the transnational stuff early on in the 70s did separate deals. So all the way through the decade, and in fact the US was involved as well. There were channels with Black September that were open. So there was a CIA channel that was open. There were the French were definitely talking to the PLO. The Italians did the deal. The Swiss did a very early deal saying basically, look, just stay off our territory in terms, no, you can stay on our territory, but just don't attack any Swiss stuff. The West Germans were trying to negotiate something like that. The Austrians were still trying to negotiate something like that at the end of the 70s. So that was absolutely a problem. And I think the question is a good one. It makes me think that one of the reasons that in the early 80s, the Reagan administration pushed so hard to um, get allies in line on the new problem that they saw as terrorism was because it had been such a mess in the previous decade.
You make such a good point. It was also novel, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it just question from Angelica Plefleger. Could you please discuss the cooperation with leftist European groups such as RAF, the Red Army faction in Germany, with militant groups in the Middle East?
sure. There's an awful lot in the book about this, actually. So it's actually much less than you think in some ways, but in what did happen was important. So there are various. The broader context is that there's an awful lot of sympathy among leftists in Europe for particularly the Palestinians after 67. Earlier, the sympathy is more for Israel, actually, but from 67 on, that very rapidly gains momentum. So the Palestinians, along with apartheid, along with the Black South Africans and the Vietnamese in general, are the big causes for Western leftists. And one of the things that they believe, the more radical ones among them believe, is that it's their duty to fight imperialism, capitalism, and Zionism at home because that way they weaken the metropolitan governments, the imperialists, which strengthens the anti-colonial struggle in the global south. They also think that their own populations are too consumerist and too materialist to rise up in revolution. So the real revolution is going to have to start in the global south and then spread to the west. And that's how it's sort of formulated. And I have to say, they do believe this stuff. I mean, I've spoken to them, they still believe it, a lot of them. I mean, to us now, it seems just kind of ridiculous and a sort of misled idealism. But it was a genuine belief among many people in that period.
A question on that. So these people must be in their mid to late 70s.
Yeah,
Presumably a
most
number of them
80s.
80s, yeah. And presumably a lot of them went to jail for a long time and now are out, or how did you
Yeah, some of
well,
them did. Not all that many. I mean, some I spoke to. Who I'd speak to. Actually, quite a lot didn't, because they didn't get caught. I mean, they got certainly in the early. Basically, if you got caught in the early period, you were probably going to get released, and in the later period, you got killed.
hmm,
Um, So, I mean, one person who was in prison was Carlos the Jackal. I mean, he's been in
yeah.
prison since '94. So
And
he was in jail.
and hasn't he converted to Islamism, ironically?
Well, yeah, he has converted, but he actually converted, as I found, much earlier. Interestingly, he did a kind of conversion in '75, um, which is really interesting. And he's a very good example of this sort of meeting of supposed revolutionary minds. I mean, he's wrote a book called Revolutionary Islam, and so there's definitely those kind of in terms of language and worldview. There's a common cause, if you like. Um, but when it actually came to practical cooperation, it was really hard, and
Hmm.
not a lot of people did it. So there are famous instances of Western radicals like the Baader-Meinhof gang, the Red Army faction, going to the camps that Fatah, who were pretty progressive and pretty moderate, were running then it was Jordan, later Lebanon, and huge culture clashes as these Western leftist radicals turn up from their communes in Berlin and want to all sleep together, literally and figuratively, and go topless and don't want to follow orders, and and obviously this particular camp that they were at in I found was actually run by a Algerian war veteran who, was just completely stunned by these 25-year-old women who turned up from Stuttgart and wanted to walk about naked. And so no doubt were the ordinary Palestinian guards who must have been slightly bewildered too. So there was that going on. There's also other moments I found when the Red Army faction got close to planning an operation with actually Black September. But then this was exactly the moment when Yasser Arafat decided that they should drop that strategy and not do any of those long-range attacks. And so they called it off. And the only people who really cooperated in a sort of systematic way were the PFLP, so the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, XO, which was the breakaway group, not even the main PFLP. I mean, they did early on. That's why the 1970 attack I was talking about, you get a Nicaraguan American who is partnered with Layla Khalid, for example. So there's a deliberate trying to internationalize it from the PFLP's point of view. But really, it's just a German group called the Revolutionary Cells who get involved really systematically, and they do the OPEC attack in 75, they do Entebbe, and they do Mogadishu in 77, all quite closely coordinated with this breakaway group of the PFLP. The other leftist group, I suppose, is the Japanese Red Army, Fukusaku Shuganobu, who is really interesting, and they're very interesting in terms of their own background, and they get involved in various attacks with leftists and with the PFLP. There are a few others, but it's not as widespread as you'd think, and it was always problematic. They are, it was difficult because literally the language problem was really hard. I should say also that there's some big differences among the leftist groups, which were hard to overcome. So there were fistfights between British Maoists and Marxist Leninists in one training camp. In another, the German faction got very annoyed with the Dutch because they thought the Dutch were noobs, basically, and the Dutch thought the Germans were all really uptight. And started mentioning the Second World War, which annoyed the Germans. And I mean, this sort of thing was happening in like the Palestinian training camps as these Western European leftists were fighting each other, as I say, sometimes quite literally.
You mentioned the Vietnam War. Of course, a big demand of the leftists at the time was to end the war, and the war sort of ended. And so, I mean, did something equivalent happen in this country, in the United States, with the Weather Underground and the Black Panther, who seemed to be pretty energized by the Vietnam War? Did they collapse around the same time as Brigati Rossi and these other kind of groups?
Very early, actually. I mean, this is so. Sadly, I couldn't get into the Weather Underground in the way that I wanted to. I read quite a lot about it. It's an absolutely fascinating story, but it maps very closely the development of with the Japanese and I was talking about the Italians and the West Germans and so forth, in terms of this sort of narrative curve, if you like. And actually, I mean, the Weather Underground suffer from the same sort of problems as all the leftist groups in Europe, in that they're basically a bunch of middle-class kids who are very educated and want to change the world, and they have real difficulties building any kind of mass proletarian base. And then when it does get nasty, and there is actually lethal violence, although in the case of the Weather Underground, if I remember rightly, they actually blew up themselves rather than anybody else. Everything goes wrong quite fast, and then you're left with a very small hardcore who are actually, prepared to die or kill. And there are not very many people of that around. But so by the Weather Underground is kind of over really as a force by the early 70s. And interestingly, when they try and get it back together a bit later in the mid 70s, they're hit by this wave of identity politics because they're primarily white and middle class and such like, and they can't get it together. They have this, they try and form a coalition. They have this big conference, and the former leaders of the Weather Underground are attacked by everybody for being racist or being anti-feminist or being white or being middle class or whatever, and it just all falls apart. And so yeah, what's happening in the US is interesting. And one of the things that is really striking about the US was just the sheer numbers of attacks and every year, and in fact everywhere. So in the US, it was mainly a case of just property attacks, small bombs, pipe bombs going off outside government offices, injuring no one, but just sort of making a point. But lots of them for all sorts of different causes and reasons, all just sort of vaguely leftist or very leftist. In France, in 82, but this is late, they were opening a major terrorist incident investigation every 2 weeks. I mean, it was just really prolific.
Well, and the Communist Party was a huge force at that time in French politics, right? It's hard
Yeah, and well, Mitterrand had just taken power. So it's the socialist, socialist government who were very keen not to be seen as soft on terrorism. They knew they were vulnerable on that, and so they were pushing the police to do something. But it was just, there were just bombs going off all over the place all the time. I mean, there was just a lot of violence.
It's really worth recall. I mean, in the United States, there's so much terrorism all the time. It's Puerto Rican nationalists were blowing up bombs. There were 85 incidents. The hijackings were routine, often for criminal reasons, but sometimes to get at Cuba or whatever. And it was like, it's just hard for people to recall. It was so relatively simple to carry out these attacks because the defenses were very low.
That's a really good point. And that's something that struck me as I was writing the book is, you had West Germans who went off grid, went underground, as they'd call it. They burnt their papers. They didn't tell anyone what they were doing. And then basically, if they didn't do something really stupid, they didn't use cash a check or anything or surface. They could stay hidden in a major city for years. In fact, there was one that was caught quite recently, actually. But Carlos Jackal, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, moved around Europe relatively easily, partly because there was no real likeness of him. There were just some very bad pictures. And also because he would put on a blazer and a jacket and a pair of kind of slacks and carry a copy of the International Herald Tribune. And nobody would, think to stop him because he doesn't look like a terrorist because they're, wearing a safari suit and have got a keffiyeh. And so, I mean, the states were weak. He got away after shooting 3 policemen in Paris and killing 2 of them outright. And it took him 3 or 4 days, but he crossed Western Europe, got to East Berlin, and then flew eventually to Yemen. But I mean, he was able to do it. I mean, now it'd be inconceivable. You'd never get through. Through a train station, let alone an airport.
This is a very good question from Clark because I think it gets to some of the big questions you're trying to answer in the book. Given the information now available on former Warsaw Pact countries, how important was their provision of safe haven, logistics, etc. in the 1970s? And that gets also to this question of like the whole narrative about Soviet support for these groups. To what extent was it bullshit, or was it real, or what?
Yeah. Okay. So the Soviets were funding. There's a very good the one that caused a problem actually. A CIA analysis from about 1981, which says the Soviets are not pro-terrorism. They don't sponsor terrorism. What they do is sponsor, quotes, liberation movements who sometimes use terrorism. and so there's massive aid going to, Syria, going to RPGs being shipped to some of the Palestinian factions or something, usually via the Syrians or other allies in the region, Yemen, South Yemen it would be, um, factions in Lebanon, whoever. So there's a lot of equipment being shipped over. There's training being offered, basic infantry training, medics, stuff like that. They're scholarships at Soviet universities. There are all sorts of sort of goodies being handed out, which is part of the Soviet outreach to the developing world. I mean, they did it for everybody, and they were looking to recruit people. In fact, they did. They recruited lots of people within these organizations. And so there was that, certainly. The Eastern Europeans. Well, it's really interesting. And the person I looked at most of the Eastern Europeans was Carlos, and they were quite scared of him, erroneously, actually, because he didn't have anywhere near the capability that he pretended he had, and they believed he had. But he was able to function for 5 years after he was expelled from Baghdad in early 79. He was able to function behind the Iron Curtain as more or less a gun for hire. I mean, working for Gaddafi, al-Assad, and a couple of others, the Romanian Securitate, for example. And they funded him and ran and gave him the money, but it was people in the secret services and the leaders in Berlin and in East Berlin, that would be, and Prague and Budapest, who put up with him. He couldn't actually go to East Berlin, but his people could. But the others, he had a nice time hanging out in Budapest and Prague. Because whenever they said, look, it's a bit problematic that you're here, he just said, oh, nice capital city you've got here. You wouldn't want anything to happen to it. And they backed off. And they also had difficulties, again, actually tracking him, because he was using diplomatic visas provided by, again, often the Yemenis or the Syrians. And so actually stopping him going through any borders was actually quite hard, because he's actually got a bona fide diplomatic visa. And then so they'd call the Yemeni embassy, and the Yemeni embassy would go, oh, no, that is absolutely whoever he was pretending to be. So they're a bit stumped. They did eventually get rid of him, and one of the reasons they did it was because the Americans leaned on them very heavily. And they decided it wasn't worth having him around any longer. They were taking too much of a risk. And they began to think that actually a lot of what he'd been boasting about probably wasn't true. So I think it's a complex relationship, much more complex than these guys were all run by or supported, unanimously or 100% by the Soviets or their various satellites. But there was definitely a relationship.
One final question. On the cover of your book, you have this famous picture of Layla Khaled and Khaled, and what was the influence of sort of romance and fun? And because I think sometimes people tend to underestimate.
Absolutely.
I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. I think, look, these people are really young, almost all of them. So Layla Khaled was 26 when she did her first hijacking. Carlos was 23 when he was first put up to trying to shoot someone in London. Others were younger. The Baader-Meinhof gang leaders were in their mid to late 20s, apart from Ulrike Meinhof, who was a bit older, mid 30s. So on the whole, the average age was really young, and you could call it romance, but I think it was agency, it was adventure, it was camaraderie. There's a great scene in a memoir. Actually, I contacted her, by a memoir by a German radical veteran called Margaret Schuller, who speaks of her first time she saw the leaders of the Baader-Meinhof gang together. She offered them a safe house, her apartment, student apartment, for a night, and she said they were funny and they were close. They were cooking together, smoking together, talking about changing the world. They had weapons. They were all smoking like chimneys. They were, clever people, charismatic in their way, and she'd never met anyone like them. And those kind of dynamics, I think you're absolutely right. We can very easily forget, and that was a major driver for a lot of people initially. I mean, once you're in, then maybe there are other things, and of course, there's an ideological hinterland, and there's a lot of identity stuff going on. But yeah, just the attraction of that moment to a often slightly unhappy or slightly destabilized young person. Or older actually, is, I think, a very important factor.
Well, thank you, Jason. The book is The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked 1970s. It's got a lot of fabulous reviews. On behalf of the audience, Jason, we want to thank you and good luck with the rest of the book tour.